much in this gospel reading this Sunday. We could talk about Peter who becomes Rocky. We could talk about the gates of the netherworld. We could talk about the secret of the Christ. There are a couple of things for us at the beginning to reflect on. One is the notion of the gates of the netherworld. So often when we were raised, we grew up in an environment in the church where the gates of the netherworld will never prevail against us. It was as if we were under attack. And we are. But the message here is that Peter says, you are the Christ. You are the anointed one who is to gather the nations and to defeat sin and death. So the message is, sisters and brothers, fear not. Sin and death don't win. But the question, whenever we encounter one of these big questions in life, who do you say that I am? There are often many other questions that follow right behind it. Those of you who have asked this question and answered it, will you marry me? You know that there's one question, and there are lots of questions that follow right behind. When? How soon? How do we do that? Where will we live? All the things that come with that big question. So when Peter is asked that question, when the disciples are asked that question, part of the question is not only who do you say that I am, but how does it affect your life? How does it change our life to say, you are the anointed one, you are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God? In a way, what difference in our lives do we see? Our images of God have a lot to do with that answer. When we answer, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, embedded in us very often is our images of God that we have from our childhood. When we talked about loosening the gates, loosening what you loose in heaven, you loose on earth. Growing up again, there was so much of an emphasis on sin, that we saw ourselves so much as sinner. And that's appropriate. Pope Francis, when asked this question, he answers it this way. Of himself, he says, I am a sinner. And of Jesus, he says, he is the face of the mercy of God. The face of the mercy of God. In 1998, Father Ron Rolheiser wrote a book called The Holy Longing. It's become probably one of the most popular spiritual classics in the last 22 years. And in that book, as he makes his way through a study of Christian spirituality, he goes to the images of God and how they affect us. And he talks about those of us who have a conservative leaning and those of us who have a liberal leaning. Now, I realize we're right between the two conventions, so don't hear that as Republican or Democrat. What he's saying is, theologically, spiritually, are we more conservative? Are we more liberal? Are we more... So he writes this. In conservative religious circles, the old punishing God has been replaced by the God of orthodoxy. He is still a God whose primary facial expression is a frown. He is looking at the world and seeing there a confused, morally lax, lazy, sexually promiscuous rabble. He cheers up once in a while when we pull ourselves together. But first, his mode of reaction is still displeasure. On the liberal, he writes, liberal circles are different, but no closer to what is prescribed by the first commandment. Their God tends to be the God of liberal ideology, is very anxious, worried, hypersensitive, politically correct, a workaholic, and generally a whining God. This God still wears a frown. And when he looks at the world, His reaction is not one of blessing, but of disapproval at the world's stupidity and lack of social conscience. He says that we fail to remember that at the moment of creation, when God has completed creation, we're told that He says, "It is very good." That all God created was very good. And that first appreciation never stops. We're raised, sisters and brothers, with such onerous understandings of God and His judgment instead of His love. This summer I happened to have the opportunity to take a course. It was a course on, essentially, it involved a lot of medieval theology. But along the way, we were introduced to a reading, to a writer, Julian of Norwich. I'm in my 60s. I wish I had discovered Julian of Norwich when I was in my 20s. So important for all of us gathered here today. Julian of Norwich in 1373 struck ill, this young English woman, struck ill, has a series of visions, and records them in a book that you can find under two different titles, The Showings of Divine Love, or The Revelations of Divine Love. But in this book, she records 16 experiences of God's coming to her in the midst of this sickness. And along the way, one of the most important things that happens is her appreciation of God's love for each one of us. So along these revelations, she writes this: "And then our Lord opened my spiritual eyes and showed me my soul in the middle of my heart. I saw the soul as large as if it were an endless world, as if it were a holy kingdom. And from the properties I saw in it, I understood it to be a glorious city. And in the center of that city, in my soul, in my heart, sits our Lord Jesus, God and man, a handsome person and of great stature, the highest bishop, the most imposing king, the most glorious Lord. And I saw him dressed imposingly and gloriously. He sits in the soul, in the very center, at rest in peace. It seems to me that in all eternity, Jesus will never leave the position which he takes in our soul. Oh my goodness, sisters and brothers. It is one thing to say, Jesus, you are Lord. You are the Son of the living God. It's another to integrate that into our lives. Our life journeys are paths of fallings and failings and wrong turns. And Julian says to us, but the Lord never leaves the center of my soul. All along that journey. In fact, she comes to this wonderful statement. Sin is nothing to God. Sin is nothing to God. Sin, sisters and brothers, she's not giving us an excuse. She's saying sin has everything to do with us. But for God, it is no reason to leave the soul. That God's love is never withdrawn from us. All of our life's journey, in the crooks and in the turns. That Jesus, Lord, through baptism, comes to us and stays with us in order to do what? In order to love us to glory. To love us to glory. Sisters and brothers, let us ask ourselves in the day in which we live, in the culture in which we live, in which there is so much division, in which there is so much animosity, in which there is so much hatred and distrust, let us ask the question, who do you say that I am? And if we recognize Jesus, Lord and King, as King of our hearts, what a difference it will make.